There is a Ferris wheel outside the town of Corliss, Nebraska, that has not turned in 11 years. It stands at the north edge of the Ray County Fairgrounds, 45 feet of gray steel leaning 2 degrees off true. For 11 autumns, the wind came down off the plain and pushed at it, and the wheel held. It was built in 1948 by the Eli Bridge Company of Jacksonville, Illinois, a big Eli model with 12 seats and a center bearing the size of a dinner plate. And the man who kept it turning for 51 years is buried in the Corliss Cemetery, under a stone that reads only his name and 2 dates. Most people in that town could not have told you the man's name if you stopped them on the street. They knew him as the fair mechanic. They knew him as the one who smelled of diesel and kept to himself. They did not know that on the last day of every fair, for 44 years, he walked into the bank on Main Street and bought a United States savings bond and told no one why. 2 sisters found out why. They were homeless when they found out. The older one was 22 and the younger one was 19. Between them, they had $47.13, a duffel bag, and a car that burned a quart of oil every 100 miles. They were deeded the entire fairgrounds, the wheel, the booths, the 40 acres of frostbitten grass, for a single $1. It was signed over to them by a dying man who could not stand to see the place scrapped because it was late October and they needed a roof, and the ticket booth had a roof, and nobody else in the county would take the place. They did not know the wheel was leaning over a fortune. They did not know the man who buried it was their own blood. They found both of those things out in the same cold week, with their hands in the dirt, and it changed the rest of their lives. But to understand how 2 girls with almost nothing to their name came to own a dead man's secret, we need to go back. Not far. Just to the beginning of that October, and to a 2-lane highway coming up out of Kansas with the heater blowing lukewarm air and the sun going down in the rearview mirror. Della Marsh was driving because Della always drove. She was the older one, and she had taught herself on a gravel road when she was 15, and she did not trust her sister's foot on the brake. She was a plain, careful girl with brown hair. She cut herself and hands that were always doing something, folding a receipt, smoothing a map, counting the bills in the coffee can they kept between the seats. She counted the money 3 times a day, and she never lied about the number. $47.13. That was what stood between the 2 of them and nothing at all. Her sister Junie was asleep against the window with her boots up on the dash, which Della had told her 100 times not to do. Junie was 19 and built like a whip, all elbows and quick temper, and she could take apart a carburetor faster than Della could read the manual. Their mother used to say Junie was born with a wrench in her fist and a chip on her shoulder, and their mother had not been wrong. Junie argued with gas station clerks and highway patrolmen and once, memorably, with a judge. But she had also spent 3 nights sleeping upright in a hospital chair, so Della could lie flat across 2 others, and she had never once complained about the cold, and Della loved her the way you love the last thing you have left. Their mother had been dead for 14 months. Junie Marsh had died in a county hospital in Kansas of a pneumonia that started as a cough she would not see a doctor about, because seeing a doctor cost money they did not have. She left her daughters a 1994 Buick with 190,000 miles on it, a box of photographs, a cross on a thin chain that Della now wore, and a silence about her own past so complete that the girls did not know the name of the town she had grown up in. Nadine had left home at 17. That was the whole of what she would say. She left at 17 and she never went back, and when the girls asked why, she looked at them in a way that closed the subject like a door. After the funeral, the 2 of them had tried to hold on. Della cleaned rooms at a motel off the interstate, and Junie worked the counter at a tire shop. And for a while, they made rent on a single room with a hot plate and a shared bathroom down the hall. Then the motel cut Della's hours, and the tire shop closed. And the room they rented was sold to a man who wanted to tear the building down. And by the first week of October, they were living in the Buick. They had been living in the Buick for 19 days when Della saw the notice. It was pinned to a corkboard in the entryway of a public library in a town whose name neither of them would remember, one of a dozen fluttering county notices about zoning and dog licenses and a school board election. Della had gone into the library because it was warm and because they let you sit there, and while Junie charged her phone in the wall by the magazines, Della read every notice on the board twice, the way she read everything twice. The one that stopped her was a photocopy, gray and crooked, placed by a lawyer's office in Ray County, Nebraska. Property to be deeded, it said. The last trustee of the former Ray County Fair Association wished to sign over the improvements and equipment of the closed Ray County Fairgrounds, shut since 2011, to any responsible party willing to take title and assume the taxes. No price asked, but the recording fee and a token dollar to make the deed legal. It gave a name, Harlan Voss, and an address, and a phone number. And at the bottom, in the careful language of a lawyer, it said the property would be conveyed as is, where is, with no warranty of any kind, and that the trustee reserved no obligation for maintenance or removal. Della read it 3 times. Then she copied the phone number onto the back of her hand with a library pen and went and shook her sister awake. They argued about it for 4 days, which was to say Junie argued and Della waited. Junie said it was a scam, that nobody signed a fairground over to strangers for $1, that there was a catch. There was always a catch, and Della said maybe, and kept driving north. Junie said even if it was real, it would be a wreck, a dump, a tetanus farm, and Della said probably, and kept driving. What Della did not say, because she did not have the words for it and would not have used them if she had, was that she was 22 years old and had been cold for 19 nights, and she wanted, more than she had wanted anything in a long time, to own a door she could lock from the inside, a roof that was hers. $1 for a roof did not sound like a scam to Della. It sounded like the first door that had ever been left open to her. She called the number from a gas station payphone in a town in the middle of Nebraska because her cell had run out of minutes. A woman at a lawyer's office answered, an older-sounding woman with a voice like she was tired of the whole business, and Della asked if the offer on the fairgrounds was real. There was a pause on the line. The woman said it was real. She said Mr. Voss had been trying to give the place away for 3 years and nobody would take it, that he was the last man alive off the old fair board and his health was failing, and that he had said he would pay somebody to haul it off if that was what it came to. She said if Della came and signed the papers and took on the taxes, she could have it and God help her. Della asked what exactly she would be getting. The woman said the wheel, the buildings, the booths, the old horse barn, and whatever hadn't been stolen already. Then she said something Della did not understand at the time and would understand completely 3 weeks later. She said, the ground it sits on was never the association's to give, so read your papers, but everything standing on it is yours if you want it. Della wrote it all down. Then she got back in the car and told Junie they were going to Corliss. Corliss, Nebraska, sat at the bottom of a shallow valley where 2 county roads crossed, 1,140 people according to the sign at the edge of town, though Della suspected the sign was optimistic. They came in from the south at dusk with the tank near empty and passed a grain elevator, a boarded-up implement dealer, a Lutheran church with a lit sign out front, and a short main street that was half businesses and half plywood. 3 of the storefronts were dark. One had a hand-lettered sign in the window that said the building was for sale, please call, and under it a number so faded by sun that the last 2 digits were gone. The one place with light spilling out onto the sidewalk was a diner near the end of the block, a low brick building with a blue neon star in the window and the word cafe under it in white letters, and because they had eaten nothing since a bag of crackers that morning, Della parked in front of it. The woman behind the counter was somewhere past 70, small and upright, with reading glasses on a beaded chain and white hair pinned back hard. There was one other customer, an old man in a booth working a crossword, and a radio playing low. The woman watched the girls come in the way people in small towns watch strangers, not unfriendly, just complete, taking the whole of them in at a glance. The duffel bag Junie would not leave in the car, the way Della's coat was too thin for the weather, the tired that was on both of them like dust. She set down 2 waters without being asked, and said the meatloaf was what was left, and it was $3 and came with bread. They ordered 1 plate and 2 forks. The woman looked at that for a second and then went back to the kitchen, and when she came out, she set down 2 plates, both full, and said the second one was on the house because she'd made too much and it would only go to the pigs otherwise, which the girls both knew was not true, and neither of them said so. Her name, according to the tag pinned crooked to her apron, was Ruth Kessler. She owned the Blue Star, she told them, 41 years now, since her husband bought it and then had the poor manners to die and leave her with it. She had a dry way of talking that Junie warmed to immediately, and by the time the plates were half empty, Ruth had gotten out of them that they'd come a long way and had no place particular to be. Della said they'd come about the old fairgrounds, that a man named Harlan Voss was signing it over to them. She said it plainly, the way she said everything, and she watched the old woman's face when she said it. Ruth Kessler set down the coffee pot she'd been holding. The old man in the booth stopped writing. For a moment, the only sound in the Blue Star Cafe was the radio, and then Ruth said, in a different voice than she'd been using, "You girls are the ones Harlan's giving the fare to." Della said they meant to, if $1 and a signature were really all it took. Ruth looked at them a long moment. Then she said the strangest thing. She said, "Well, he'd have liked that. 2 girls." And before Della could ask who he was, the old man in the booth folded his newspaper and got up and put on his hat. And the moment passed, and Ruth started clearing plates and would not sit down again, and something in the room had closed the way their mother's face used to close. They spent that night in the Buick behind the Lutheran church, where the lot was gravel and out of the wind, and in the morning they drove out to Harlan Voss's house at the east edge of town, a small white place with a wheelchair ramp built onto the porch and a lawyer's sedan already parked at the curb. Harlan Voss was 84 and he was dying, and he did not pretend otherwise. He received them in a recliner in the front room with an oxygen line at his nose and a quilt over his knees. So thin the quilt seemed to be the only thing holding him down against a wind, but his eyes were clear, and they went over the 2 girls slowly and with a kind of relief. He was the last man alive off the old Ray County Fair Association, he said, the last trustee of a thing that had all but stopped existing, and the fairgrounds were the last of it left to settle. His lawyer, a younger man with a briefcase, laid the papers out on the coffee table and wanted the girls to understand, before they signed anything, exactly what they were taking on. The lawyer was honest about it, which Della respected. He told them the property was a liability. He said the wheel alone was a lawsuit waiting to happen, that if a child climbed it and fell, they would own the consequences, that the buildings were full of asbestos and rot, that the well was probably contaminated, that the taxes on the improvements ran $200 and some a year and no one would be forgiving them. He said all this plainly, so there could be no claiming later that they had not been told. And through all of it, the old man in the recliner watched the girls, and when the lawyer was done, Harlan Voss said his piece, slow, stopping for breath. He said he would not insult them by calling it a gift, because it wasn't much of one. But he said the place had been the heart of the county once, and the man who kept it running had put his whole life into it, and it was not right that it should go to the scrappers for the weight of its steel. He said he would rather sign it over to somebody young who might do something with it than lie awake, knowing it had been hauled off in pieces. He looked at Della a moment longer than he looked at Junie, the way a man looks at a face that reminds him of another face he cannot quite place, and then the moment passed, and he said, "Well, are you going to take it or not?" So she signed. She signed on the line the lawyer showed her, and Junie signed as the second party the way the lawyer said to. And Della laid a single dollar bill on the coffee table from the coffee can, because the deed needed a price on it to be a deed, and the lawyer notarized it and gave her a copy. And just like that, the 2 of them owned the Ray County Fairgrounds. Harlan Voss closed his eyes when it was done, and something went out of his face that had been holding on there for 3 years, and he told them to go on out and look at what they'd gotten themselves into, and to fix the wheel if they could, and not to let anybody talk them into scrapping it. Then he was tired, and the lawyer walked them to the door. Harlan Voss died 3 weeks later, in that same recliner, and the girls would not understand until long after that. The last thing the old man ever signed his name to was the deed that put his dead friend's fairground into the hands of that dead friend's own grandchildren, though not one soul in the room that morning knew it, least of all the 2 girls holding the pen. There was a man who wanted the fairgrounds, though the girls did not understand that yet either. His name was Dale Merchant, and he found them that same afternoon at the gas station on the corner where they had stopped to put $4 in the tank. He was heavyset, in his 50s, in a pressed wool overcoat, with a firm, dry handshake, and the manner of a person used to being the most important man in a small room. He said he was on the county board, and that he also ran merchant land and development, and that he had heard old Harlan had finally found somebody to take the fairgrounds off his hands. He said it lightly, smiling, but his eyes did not smile. And Della, who had spent her whole life reading the faces of men who wanted things, saw that Dale Merchant wanted something. He told them the place was a liability, that they'd be sorry inside a year, and that if they ever wanted out, he'd take it off their hands and save them the trouble. Then he handed Della a business card, cream-colored and heavy, and told her to think about it. Della put the card in her coat pocket. Later, when they were alone, she took it out and read the line under his name, which said Merchant Land and Development, and under that, in smaller letters, a phrase that meant nothing to her yet: Renewable Energy Acquisitions. She put it back in her pocket. She did not think about it again for 2 weeks. When she finally did, standing in the cold with a rolled-up piece of paper in her hand, she would understand it all at once, the way you understand a magic trick after somebody shows you the wire. The fairgrounds were 3 miles north of town on a county road, behind a chain-link gate that hung open on one hinge. They drove in slow. The grass had gone to seed and lay flat and gray under the frost, and a gravel midway ran down the center of the property, weeds coming up through it, past a row of game booths with their shutters gone and their counters warped. There was a long, open horse barn, empty, the stalls full of blown-in leaves. There was a low cinder-block building that had been the exhibition hall, its windows boarded, a basketball-sized hole in the roof. There was a bandstand, an octagonal thing with a peeling roof and a floor you would not trust your weight to. And at the north end, above all of it, the Ferris wheel. It was bigger up close than it had looked from the road. 45 feet is not tall as machines go, but standing at the base of it, in that flat country where nothing else stood higher than a grain bin, it filled the sky. The 12 seats hung dead still, rusted where the paint had failed, and the whole structure leaned. You could see it plainly once you knew to look, the top of the wheel standing a good foot and a half south of where it should have been over the base, as if the machine had spent 11 years trying, very slowly, to lie down. The center hub was a great iron casting green with old grease. A steel ladder ran up the near support tower to a maintenance platform level with the axle. On the platform, bolted to the frame where the weather had mostly spared it, was a small enameled plate, and Junie was the one who climbed up to read it, because Junie could never look at a machine without climbing it. She came down slower than she went up. She stood at the bottom with her hands in her jacket pockets and looked up at the wheel for a while before she said anything. Then she told Della what the plate said. It said the wheel had been manufactured by the Eli Bridge Company, and it gave a serial number, and it gave a year, 1948, and below that, in letters somebody had added later with a punch and a steady hand, one at a time, it said, "Maintained by S. Marsh." Junie said it out loud twice. S. Marsh. Then she looked at her sister, and Della looked back at her, and neither of them said the thing they were both thinking, which was that Marsh was not a common name, and that it was theirs. The ticket booth stood just inside the front gate, and it was the reason they had come. It was a small, square building, maybe 8 feet on a side, with a peaked roof and a service window on the front and a door on the back that still had a working lock, and it was the only structure on the whole property that was both dry and small enough to heat. Della saw that the first day and knew it was the one. The window had a plywood shutter that closed over it from the inside. The roof did not leak. There was a wooden counter along the front where somebody had once sold strips of paper tickets, and the tickets were still there, a whole roll of them faded pink in a drawer, and a metal cash box, empty, and a 3-legged stool. There was no water and no power, but there were 4 walls and a door that locked, and when Della pulled the door shut behind them the first night and the wind kept on outside without them, she sat down on the floor with her back against the counter and she cried, quietly, the way she did everything, and Junie pretended not to see because that was the kindest thing she could do. They made it livable in the way that people who have nothing make things livable. Junie ran a length of stovepipe out through a hole she cut in the back wall and set up a barrel stove she found in the horse barn, and they burned the broken slats off the game booths and the deadfall from the tree line, and the little building held heat better than the Buick ever had. Della swept it out and hung a tarp to divide off a corner and laid their 2 sleeping bags on a platform of pallets to get them off the cold floor. They filled water jugs at the spigot behind the Blue Star, which Ruth let them do without a word, and they cooked on the barrel stove, and at night Junie ran a wire from the Buick's battery to a little light so they could see. It was not a home the way other people had homes, but it was theirs, and it locked, and for the first week that was enough that neither of them thought much past it. The name did not leave them alone, though. Marsh, punched into the little plate at the top of the wheel, 1 letter at a time, by somebody who had cared enough to sign his work. Junie brought it up on the 3rd night, lying in the dark with the stove ticking as it cooled. She said, "That name up there." Della said she'd been thinking about it too. Junie said Mom never talked about her people, never once, not where she was from, not her mother's name, not her father's. She said maybe it was nothing. Marsh was a name, there were lots of them. Della said maybe. But she lay awake after Junie's breathing had gone slow and she thought about the woman at the diner setting down 2 full plates, and the thing she had said. He'd have liked that. 2 girls. As if there were a particular he, and as if he had wanted 2 girls, and as if Ruth Kessler had looked at the 2 of them and seen someone she knew. So on the 6th day Della walked the 3 miles into town alone, in the cold, and went into the Blue Star at the slow hour of the afternoon when there were no other customers, and she sat at the counter and asked Ruth Kessler who S. Marsh was. Ruth was quiet for a while. She poured 2 cups of coffee, 1 for Della and 1 for herself, which she had never done before, and she came around the counter and sat on the stool next to the girl, which she had also never done, and she wrapped both her hands around her cup as if she were cold, though the diner was warm. Then she said his name was Silas. Silas Marsh. He kept the fair running for 51 years. She said it, the way you say something you have been carrying a long time and are relieved to set down. She told Della the shape of it, that afternoon, though not all of it, because Ruth Kessler was a careful woman, and there were parts of the story that were not hers to tell. She said Silas Marsh had come to Corliss as a young man after the war, a machinist by trade, and had gone to work maintaining the county fair's equipment for a wage that was never much and got smaller as the years went on. She said that in the good years the fair had been the biggest thing that happened in Ray County, that people came from 4 counties over, that it ran a week every August and the whole town lived off it, the diner and the gas station and the motel that used to be, and that behind all of it, every year, keeping the wheel turning and the lights on and the generator running, was Silas. She said he was a quiet man. She said people thought he was simple, or sour, or a drunk, because he lived alone out past the fairgrounds in a little house that's fallen in now, and he didn't go to church, and he didn't talk much, and he always smelled of grease, she said. And here her voice changed, that people in this town thought a great many things about Silas Marsh, and that almost none of them were true, and that she had spent 30 years wishing she'd said so out loud while it would have done him some good. Della asked what people had wrong about him. And Ruth Kessler looked at her over the top of her glasses and said, "Honey, he wasn't who people thought he was. Not even close." And then she said she'd said enough for one afternoon, and she got up and went back behind the counter, and she would not say more, except one thing, as Della was leaving. She stopped her at the door. She asked Della what her mother's name had been. Della told her. Nadine. Nadine Marsh. Ruth Kessler put her hand flat on the counter as if to steady herself. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, softly, more to herself than to the girl. So she did have them. She had 2 after all. And she told Della to go on home before it got dark, and to come back, and to bring her sister next time. And Della walked the 3 miles back to the fairgrounds in the falling dark with her heart going in a way she did not understand, turning over the words. So she did have them. As if somewhere a person had wondered, for years, whether Nadine Marsh had ever had any children at all. Della did not tell Junie everything that night. She told her the man's name was Silas Marsh, and that he had run the fair for 51 years, and that Ruth had known their mother. She did not tell her the rest, the way Ruth's hands had shaken. The thing about wasn't who people thought, because she did not have the shape of it yet herself, and she did not want to hand her sister a mystery with no end on it. But Junie, who missed nothing, watched her sister's face in the light of the little battery lamp and said, "There's more, isn't there?" And Della said, "Yes, there's more. I just don't know what it is yet." And Junie, for once, let it lie. They went into the exhibition hall 2 days later, the low cinder block building with the hole in its roof, because Junie wanted lumber off the old display shelving to shore up the footing, and Della wanted to see what was in there. It was dim inside, and it smelled of mildew and pigeon, and the light came down in a hard column through the hole in the roof and lit a circle of the concrete floor, and the rest of it was shadow. Along one wall were the ribbon boards, sheets of pegboard where the fair had hung the winner's ribbons, empty now, the little cards curled and yellow. There were folding tables collapsed against the wall. There was a scale for weighing prize hogs, and behind a sheet of warped plywood, where the pigeons could not get to it, there was a run of framed photographs. They were photographs of the fair. Somebody had hung them years ago, a history of the thing, the earliest ones brown and cracked and the later ones color gone orange with age, and Della wiped the dust off the glass with her sleeve and looked at them one at a time in the column of light. The Ray County Fair in 1951, a crowd in hats, the wheel new and gleaming behind them. The fair in 1963, a girl in a sash holding a rooster. The fair in the 70s, the midway full, the booths bright, more people in that one photograph than lived in Corliss now. And in the corner of nearly every one of them, if you knew to look, off to the side, never in the middle, never posed, was the same man. A lean man in coveralls with a rag in his hand or a wrench, standing back from the crowd, watching the wheel or bent over the generator. Always at the edge of the picture, always turned a little away from the camera, as if he did not want to be in it. He got older as the photographs went on. His hair went from dark to gray to white. But it was the same man in 50 years of pictures, always at the edge, always working, and Della stood in the cold hall and looked from one photograph to the next, watching a man grow old in the corners of other people's happiness, and she understood before she had any proof of it at all that she was looking at her grandfather, and that he had spent his whole life exactly there, at the edge of the frame, holding up the thing everyone else was smiling in front of. Junie came and stood beside her and looked too, and neither of them said anything for a long while. Then Junie reached up and lifted one of the frames off its nail, a color photograph from 1979 of the wheel lit up at night against a dark sky, and on the back, in pencil, in that small square hand they did not yet know but would come to know as well as their own, someone had written the date in 3 words. Best crowd yet. Junie put the frame under her arm and carried it back to the ticket booth and stood it on the counter against the wall, and it stayed there all winter. The wheel lit up at night, so that the two of them fell asleep every night that hard, cold winter looking at a photograph of the machine they slept beside, in the years when it still turned, taken by a man they did not yet know had been waiting his whole life for them. The weather turned hard that week. A front came down out of the Dakotas and the temperature dropped into the teens at night, and the wind came across the open ground with nothing to stop it, and that was when the wheel started to worry them. In a hard wind you could hear it. It did not turn. The brake had rusted solid years ago, and Silas Marsh had chained the wheel besides, so it stood locked, but the whole structure would take the gusts and flex, and there would come from it a long, low groan of stressed metal, a sound that carried across the fairgrounds and into the ticket booth and into their sleep. And leaning the way it leaned, a foot and a half off plumb and getting worse, it was leaning toward the midway, toward the booths, toward, if a person drew the line out far enough, the front gate and the little building where they slept. Junie was the one who said it first. standing out in the cold morning, looking up at it with her breath smoking. She said, "That thing is going to come down. Maybe not this year, but it's coming down, and when it does, it's coming down that way." And she pointed south, down the line of the lean, past the booths, toward the gate. And Della looked where she pointed and understood that they had been handed a roof, and that 45 feet of 1948 steel was slowly, patiently, leaning toward it. They could have moved the booth. They talked about it, but there was nowhere better to put it, and it was heavy, and winter was on them, and Junie did not think that way besides. Junie thought about the wheel the way a doctor thinks about a patient. She spent 2 full days walking around it, climbing it, lying under it, and by the end of the second day she had figured out what was wrong with it, and it was the kind of thing that was wrong that a person could fix if they were stubborn enough and did not know any better than to try. The wheel stood on 2 steel support towers, and each tower stood on a concrete footing sunk into the ground, and the south footing had failed. Water had gotten under it over the years, and frost had heaved it, and the ground beneath it had washed and settled, so that the south footing had tipped and dropped maybe 3 inches, and the whole wheel had followed it, leaning south. The steel itself was sound. The bearing was frozen but sound. The problem was in the ground. Junie said if they could get the south footing lifted back to level and shored up underneath so it stayed there, the wheel would stand plumb again, and it would stand for another 50 years. And if they didn't, it would keep leaning until some hard winter it went over. She said this with a certainty that Della had learned not to argue with, because Junie was wrong about many things, but she was almost never wrong about a machine. So they started to dig. They dug out the ground around the south footing with a shovel and a mattock they found in the horse barn, working an hour at a time before their hands went too cold to hold the tools, thawing them at the barrel stove and going back out. It was slow. The ground was half frozen at the top and heavy clay underneath, and the footing turned out to be bigger than it looked, a block of poured concrete maybe 4 feet on a side going down into the earth. Junie's plan was to dig down beside it, get a bottle jack and some timbers under the low edge, jack it back up to level a little at a time, and pack rock and concrete underneath to hold it. It was the kind of plan that a crew with the right equipment would have done in a day, and that 2 girls with a shovel did over the better part of 2 weeks. It was in the middle of that digging that Dale merchant came back. He drove out on a cold gray afternoon in a clean white pickup and parked at the gate and walked up the midway to where they were working, in a canvas coat that had never seen a day's work, and he stood with his hands in his pockets and watched Junie down in the hole for a while before he said anything. Then he said they were wasting their time. He said it almost gently. He said a thing like that couldn't be saved, that even if they got it standing, it was a hazard, and the county would never let them run it. That they were 2 young girls freezing in a ticket booth digging a hole for a machine that was worth more as scrap than it would ever be worth standing. He said he'd been thinking about them. He said he'd give them $1,000 for the whole property, walk-away money, today, and they could go somewhere warm and start over, and he'd handle the wheel and the buildings and the mess, and they'd never have to think about Corliss again. $1,000. Della felt the number land in her chest. $1,000 was more money than the 2 of them had held at one time in 2 years. $1,000 was a room with a door and a heater that ran on a switch and food that came from a store instead of a can. She looked at Junie, down in the hole, and Junie had stopped digging and was looking up at Dale Merchant with an expression Della knew well, and Della got a word in before her sister could, because whatever Junie was about to say was going to be sharp, and Della wanted to keep this civil. Della asked him why. She asked it plain. She said, "If it's all a hazard and a mess and worth nothing, why do you want it?" And she watched his face. It was only a flicker. A man like Dale Merchant did not give much away. But Della had spent her life reading men, and she saw it, the small tightening around his eyes, the beat too long before he answered. He said he didn't want it, exactly. He said he was trying to do them a kindness. He said the county had been after him for years to figure out something to do with the place, and he'd rather see it cleaned up than see 2 kids get hurt on it. It was a good answer. It was smooth and it was reasonable, and every word of it was shaped to sound like generosity. And Della did not believe a single syllable of it, because a man does not drive out 3 miles in the cold to offer $1,000 for something he thinks is worthless. She told him they weren't selling. She said it politely. She thanked him for the offer. Dale Merchant looked at her for a moment, and then he looked down at Junie in the hole, at the dirt piled around the base of the footing, at the timbers and the jack, and something in his face changed. A small, careful attention, as though he had just noticed what they were actually doing and did not entirely like it. He asked, in a lighter voice, what they were digging for. Junie said they weren't digging for anything. They were fixing the footing. Merchant said, of course, and smiled, and said, well, watch yourselves down there. Old fairgrounds like this. You never know what's buried. And he said it as a pleasantry, the kind of nothing a man says leaving. But Della heard it, and she filed it away, and later she would take it out and look at it, because of all the things Dale Merchant said that afternoon. That was the one that turned out to be true. He left the cream-colored cardigan, tucked into the chain link by the gate, in case they changed their minds. Junie threw it in the stove that night without reading it. Della fished the ashes for it out of habit, and it was gone, and it did not matter, because she still had the first one in her coat pocket with the line she had not thought about yet. Renewable energy acquisitions. They kept digging. And on the 9th day of digging, with the hole beside the south footing down almost 5 feet and Junie's plan finally close to working, Junie's shovel hit steel. It was not the footing. The footing was concrete and gray, and they knew its shape by now, the way you know a thing you have been touching for 2 weeks. This was off to the side of the footing, a foot down and a foot out from the corner, and it rang under the shovel with a different sound, a hollow ring, not the dull knock of the concrete. Junie stopped. She got down on her knees in the bottom of the hole and cleared the dirt away with her hands, and Della lay down at the edge above her and looked, and in the gray light there came up out of the frozen clay the top of a steel pipe. It was a piece of well casing, Junie said, once she'd cleared enough to see it, 12 inches across, thick-walled steel, set upright in the ground, and where the top of it should have been open, it was capped instead, a steel plate welded over the end in a ring of old, careful weld. She wiped the frost off the cap with her sleeve. The weld was neat, professional, laid down by a hand that knew what it was doing. The steel had a coat of something black and tarry brushed over it that had kept the rust off, mostly in the dry Nebraska ground. And it was not old. The concrete of the footing had been poured in 1948. This had been buried later, next to it, carefully, by somebody who had dug down beside a footing that was already there and set a sealed steel cylinder into the ground and covered it back over so that no one would ever know it was there unless they did exactly what these 2 girls had just spent 2 weeks doing. Junie sat back on her heels in the bottom of the hole and looked up at her sister. Neither of them said anything for a moment. The wind came across the fairgrounds and moved the wheel above them, and it groaned, that long, low sound. And Della, lying at the lip of the hole, looking down at the capped steel pipe her grandfather had welded shut and buried under his own wheel 40 years before either of them was born, felt the whole cold afternoon go very quiet and very sharp, the way the air goes before something happens that you will remember for the rest of your life. They did not open it that day. They could not. The cap was welded on all the way around, and the pipe went down into the ground deeper than they had dug, and they had a hacksaw with a dull blade and a cold coming on, and the light was going. Junie wanted to keep at it in the dark. Della made her stop. Della had a caution in her that Junie did not, and something about the neatness of that weld, the care of it, the black tar brushed over the steel, made her want to sit with it before they broke it open. Somebody had gone to a great deal of trouble to put this in the ground and keep it dry and keep it hidden. Whatever was inside had mattered to that person more than almost anything. Della did not want to tear into it with a dull hacksaw in the dark like it was a thing they'd found. She wanted to open it right, so they filled the top of the hole loose over the cap so it wouldn't show, and they went back to the booth, and they barely slept. The next morning Junie walked into Corliss and came back 3 hours later on foot carrying a hacksaw with a good sharp blade and 2 spares, and a can of cutting oil, and a cold chisel, which she had bought at the hardware store in the next town with $11 of their money, because the hardware store in Corliss had closed in 2009. She did not tell the man at the counter what it was for. They went back to the hole together, and Junie got down in it and went to work on the weld, an inch at a time, the oil and the steel filings turning to black paste on her hands, resting when her arm gave out and handing the saw up to Della, who was slower but steady. It took most of the day. The wheel groaned above them in the wind the whole time, that long, patient sound, and it began to seem to both of them, though neither said it, that the wheel knew what they were doing and did not mind. The cap came free a little before dark. Junie worked the cold chisel into the last of the cut and levered it, and the steel plate bent up with a screech, and there was the open mouth of the pipe, black inside, and a smell came up out of it of oil and old paper and cold iron. Junie shone the battery light down into it. Something was in there, wrapped, packed down tight, filling the pipe nearly to the top. She reached in with both hands and worked the first bundle loose and lifted it up into the gray light, and they carried it back to the ticket booth to open it where it was warm, because Della said if they were going to do this, they were going to do it right, at the counter, with the light on, and not on their knees in a hole in the dark. The bundle was wrapped in oilcloth, the old kind, waxed canvas gone stiff with the cold, and it was tied with waxed cord in a knot that Junie had to cut. Inside the oilcloth was another wrapping of heavy brown paper, and inside that were ledgers. 3 of them, hardbound account books, the pages close-written in pencil in a small square hand. Della opened the first one on the counter and turned the pages under the light, and at first she did not understand what she was looking at, because it was not what she had let herself imagine on the long night before. It was not money. It was records. They were the records of the fair. Year by year, going back, the first entry was dated August of 1955, every year of the Ray County Fair, written out in that small, careful hand. But not the county's records. These were something else, something private, a shadow set of books that one man had kept for himself over half a century. There were the prize lists, the name of every child who had won a ribbon at the fair, the blue and the red and the white, the 4-H steers and the canning and the quilts and the pies, hundreds of names, thousands, going back decades. There were notes beside some of them. Della read them aloud in the lamplight, and they were small and plain, and they broke something open in her chest as she read. Beside a name in 1961, paid this boy's entry fee, family had a bad year, don't let him know. Beside a name in 1974, gave the Peterson girl the wheel for free all week, her father passed in the spring. Beside a name in 1988, covered the shortfall on the premiums again, $340, told the board it came from an anonymous donor, page after page of it, year after year. A man sitting alone in a little house past the fairgrounds, writing down in pencil every quiet thing he had done for people who never knew he had done it. The entry fees he had paid for children whose families were short, the prize money he had made up out of his own pocket when the county cut the fair's budget, year after year, so that no child who won a ribbon ever learned that the money behind it had run out. The families he had carried through bad years. It was all there, all of it, kept not so anyone would ever see it. He had buried it in a pipe in the ground, but only, it seemed, so that he himself would not forget, so that one man would hold the account of a town's small mercies, even if the town never knew the account existed. Junie had gone very quiet, turning the pages. And then, tucked between the second ledger and the third, wrapped separately in its own square of oilcloth, they found the money. It was bonds. United States, savings, bonds, hundreds of them, banded in bundles with rubber bands gone to powder. Each one a stiff engraved certificate with an eagle and a serial number and a face value printed in the corner, $25 and $50 and $100, some of them, and a date of issue. Della spread a handful of them out under the light. The dates ran back into the 1960s and forward into the 2000s. And she remembered, then, what Ruth Kessler had never quite told her, and what she had half heard somewhere, that on the last day of every fair for 44 years, Silas Marsh had walked into the bank on Main Street and bought a savings bond and told no one why. They were holding the why. 44 years of it, a bond a year and often more, bought out of a mechanic's small wage, set aside and buried. Neither of them knew, that night, what the bonds were worth. Junie counted them instead, twice, and got the same number both times. 212. 212 United States savings bonds in a steel pipe under a Ferris wheel. But it was not the bonds that changed everything. The bonds were only money, and money, both girls knew better than most, was only money. What changed everything was at the very bottom of the pipe, wrapped last and deepest, so that it was the first thing put in and would be the last thing found, and Junie had to reach in almost to her shoulder to work it free. It was a smaller bundle, and lighter, and when they unwrapped it on the counter, it was letters. A stack of envelopes, maybe a dozen, tied with the same waxed cord, and the paper was writing paper, and the ink was blue, and across the front of the top envelope, in that same small square hand they had been reading all night, was written a single line. It said, "For my girls, Nadine's children, if she ever had any. If you are reading this, I am sorry, I never knew you." Neither of them moved for a long moment. Della's hands had gone still on the counter. Junie was looking at the envelope the way you look at a snake in a path. And then Junie said, very quietly, in a voice Della had not heard from her since their mother died, she said, "Della Nadine. That's Mom." And Della said yes. That's Mom. And they understood, both of them, at the same moment, in the little warm room with the wind outside and the wheel groaning in the dark, that the man who had welded that pipe shut and buried it under his own machine and filled it with a lifetime of quiet kindnesses and 44 years of saved-up money, the man whose name was punched one letter at a time into the plate at the top of the wheel, S. Marsh, was their mother's father, was their grandfather, was blood, and that he had written these letters not to anyone in the world but to them, to two grandchildren he had never met and could only hope might someday exist, and had put them in the ground, and had trusted the wheel to keep them until somebody who belonged to him came and dug them up. Della opened the first letter with her thumb, carefully, along the seam, and she read it aloud, because Junie asked her to, and because she did not think she could have stood to read it silently to herself. The letters were not all written at once. That was the first thing they understood. The dates on them ran across almost 20 years, one every year or two, so that reading them in order was like watching a man grow old alone at a kitchen table, writing to grandchildren he was not sure he had, in the hope that one day they would exist and would find him. The earliest one was dated the year their mother would have turned 20. In it, Silas Marsh wrote plainly, as he wrote everything, that his daughter Nadine had left home at 17, and that it had been his fault. He did not make excuses for himself. He said he had been a hard man after his wife died, that he had put the fair and his grief ahead of his own child, that Nadine had gotten in trouble with a boy at 17, and that instead of standing with her, he had said a thing to her that no father should ever say to a daughter, and that she had left the next morning and he had let her go, because he was too proud and too ashamed to go after her, and that by the time his pride broke, it was too late, and he did not know where in the country she had gone. He wrote that he had looked for her. Every year he wrote about looking. He had spent money he did not have on a man in Omaha who found people, and the man had found a Junie Marsh once in Kansas and once in Colorado and had lost her both times. He wrote that he had thought, when the man found her in Kansas, that she might have a child by then, that he might be a grandfather and not know it, and that the thought of it had undone him, alone out there past the fairgrounds. He wrote that he did not blame her for not wanting to be found. He wrote that if she had children, and if they ever came to this place, and if they ever found what he had left, he wanted them to know one thing above all others, and he wrote it in that small square hand pressed hard enough into the paper that the letters showed through on the back. He wrote, "I did one thing right in my life. I kept the wheel turning. Everything else I own is in the ground beneath it, and it is yours. And I am sorry I was not a better man while I could still be one to your face." There was more. There was a letter about the town, about how the fair had started to die when the young people left and the farms got bought up and the county cut the budget, and how he had kept it going out of his own pocket long past the point of sense, because he believed, he wrote, that a town needs 1 week a year when it remembers it is a town, when the children win ribbons and the old people sit in the shade, and everybody is in one place at one time. And that when that week is gone, the town does not know yet that it is dying, but it has begun to. There was a letter, one of the last, in a shakier hand, in which he wrote that he was 78 and his heart was bad, and he did not think he had many more fares in him, and that he had welded the pipe shut that summer for the last time, and that he had thought about telling somebody, about leaving word at the bank or with a lawyer, and had decided against it, because a lawyer would want to know who the money was for, and he did not have a name to give, only a hope. So he had trusted the wheel instead. He wrote, "If no one of mine ever comes, then let it stay in the ground, and let the wheel keep its secret, and no harm done. But if you are reading this, then Nadine had children after all, and you have come home, and that is more than I dared to pray for. Take what is yours, fix the wheel if you can, and forgive an old man who loved a town better than he loved his own girl, and spent the rest of his life trying to make up the difference to strangers because the one who mattered was gone." Junie did not cry. Junie almost never cried. She sat on the three-legged stool with her oil-black hands hanging between her knees, and she looked at the floor for a long time. And then she got up and went outside into the cold and stood under the wheel in the dark, and Della let her be, because there are things a person has to do alone. Della sat at the counter with the letters and read the last one again. And then she folded it back along its worn creases and set it on top of the others, and she thought about her mother, Nadine, who had died in a county hospital in Kansas rather than spend money she did not have, who had left home at 17 and never gone back, who had held a silence about her own father so complete and so hard, that her daughters had grown up not knowing they had a grandfather at all, let alone one who had spent 20 years writing to them and looking for them and saving up a fortune in the ground against the chance that they might someday exist. All that anger, all those years. And the man at the other end of it, out here alone, keeping the account, buying the bonds, welding the pipe, punching his name one letter at a time into a plate at the top of a wheel, so that if his blood ever came looking, they would know he had been here. Two people who had loved each other and could not say it, and had let a whole life go by in the not saying, and were both in the ground now, and it had fallen to the two of them, the granddaughters, to be the ones who finally opened the door that had stayed shut between father and daughter for 30 years. Della understood, sitting there, that her mother had never told them about Corliss, not because she did not care, but because she cared too much, and it hurt too much. And that was its own kind of love, the crooked kind, the kind that runs in some families like a bad well runs bad water, and she forgave her mother for it completely, all at once, in the warm little room. And that was the first gift the pipe gave her, before a single bond was ever counted or cashed. In the morning, they wrapped everything back up, the ledgers and the bonds and the letters, and they put it all in the duffel bag, and they drove into Corliss to see Ruth Kessler, because there was no one else in the world to show it to, and because Della had understood, finally, what Ruth had meant, and she needed to hear the rest. Ruth Kessler was alone in the Blue Star when the two girls came in and set a duffel bag on the counter, and Della opened it and took out the top ledger and laid it open in front of her. Ruth put on her glasses. She read a few lines, and then a few more, and her hand came up to her mouth, and she sat down heavily on a stool as if her legs had gone. She turned the pages slowly. When she came to the notes in the margins, the entry fees paid in secret, the prize money made up out of his own pocket, the families carried through bad years, she made a small sound, and she took her glasses off and pressed the back of her hand to her eyes, and she stayed like that for a while, and neither girl rushed her. When she could talk, she told them the rest of it. She had kept the fair's books for the county for 30 years, she said, so she was the one person in Corliss who had known something was wrong with the numbers. Every few years, the premium fund, the money that paid out the prizes, should have run dry, because the county kept cutting it, and every few years, somehow, it didn't. There was always just enough. She had asked the board about it once, and been told an anonymous donor made up the difference. And she had believed that, more or less, for 30 years, because the alternative made no sense, that a mechanic on a poverty wage was quietly emptying his own pockets into a fund for other people's children. She said she had suspected it was Silas near the end. She said there had been a year the fund came up exactly $340 short and was exactly $340 made whole a week later, and she had happened to see that same week that Silas Marsh had not paid his own electric bill, and she had put it together and said nothing because she thought he would not want her to, she said. And here she looked at the two of them very steadily, that this was what she had meant. That afternoon, when she told Della he was not who people thought he was. She said the town had buried Silas Marsh 6 years ago as a sad, odd, solitary man that a dozen people came out for, and that the truth was they had buried the man who had held the whole town together with his own 2 hands for 50 years and never let one soul thank him for it. She said she had known a piece of it and been ashamed her whole life that she never stood up in a room and said so out loud. And now, she said, putting her hand flat on the open ledger, now here it all was, in his own hand, and his own granddaughters had brought it to her, and she did not know whether she was the happiest she had ever been or the saddest. Then Della took out the bonds and set them on the counter in their crumbling rubber bands, 212 of them, and asked Ruth Kessler if she knew what they were worth. And Ruth, who had kept books her whole life, picked up one of the oldest ones, a $50 bond issued in 1968, and looked at it a long moment and told the girls to sit down, because a savings bond, she said, is not worth what it says on the front. It keeps growing. It has been growing, some of these, for 50 years. She said she could not tell them the number off the top of her head, but she said they were going to want to talk to somebody at a bank, and soon, and she said it in a careful voice, the voice of a woman who has just done some arithmetic in her head and startled herself with the answer. The bank was in the county seat, 40 minutes east, and the woman who helped them was a loan officer named Carol, who had never in her career been handed 212 savings bonds across her desk by 2 girls in barn coats. She had to call the branch manager, and then the manager had to look up how to even do it. And they gave the girls coffee in paper cups and put them in a small carpeted office and told them it would take some time to run the values, because each bond had to be looked up by series and issue date, and the older ones, the ones from the 60s and 70s, had earned decades of interest and reached their final maturity long ago and were worth many times their face. It took most of a day. Della and Junie sat in the small office and did not touch the coffee and did not talk much. And late in the afternoon, Carol came back in with a printout and sat down across from them and set it on the desk and turned it around so they could read it, and at the bottom, circled in blue pen, was the total, $214,320. Neither of them said anything. Junie read the number and read it again, and then she looked at her sister, and Della was looking at the number the way you look at a word in a language you don't speak, and the loan officer, who was a kind woman, gave them a moment and then said quietly that the money was theirs, that the bonds would need to be redeemed and there would be some paperwork and some tax, but that it was real, and it was theirs, and did they have somewhere safe to put it? And Della, who had counted $47.13 3 times a day for a year, who had cried on the floor of a ticket booth out of gratitude for a door that locked, put her hand flat on the printout the way Ruth had put her hand on the ledger, and she said, out loud, mostly to herself, "We can fix the wheel." That was the first thing she thought of. Not a house, not a car, not being warm. The wheel. We can fix the wheel now. But the money, it turned out, was not the largest thing the pipe had given them. The largest thing was in the ledgers, folded into the back of the third one, and it was Della who found it 2 nights later, going through the books again by lamplight, a document, older than the others, on heavy paper, folded in quarters and soft at the creases. It was a deed, or the record of one. And with it, clipped, was a lease agreement between Silas Marsh and the Ray County Fair Association, dated 1954, and Della read it 3 times, slowly, the way she read everything, and then she woke her sister up. The 40 acres the fair sat on had never belonged to the county, and had never belonged to the Fair Association either. It had belonged to Silas Marsh. He had bought it as a young man, 40 acres of poor ground north of town, and in 1954 he had leased it to the Ray County Fair Association for the sum of $1 a year on a 50-year lease so that the association could build the fairgrounds and run the fair without ever having to buy the land. 50 years. The lease had come due in 2004, and Silas, by then an old man, had let it run out and not renewed it. And the association, which had all but stopped running the fair by then, had not pushed him on it. And when the fair finally closed for good in 2011, there was nothing left to run, and only the improvements to settle, the wheel, the booths, the buildings, which was all the association had ever owned, and which Harlan Voss, its last living trustee, had signed over to 2 homeless girls for $1. The land underneath had reverted, quietly, unnoticed, on the day that lease expired, to Silas Marsh. And Silas Marsh had died 6 years ago without a will that anyone had ever found, leaving 1 child, Nadine, and Nadine had died 14 months ago, leaving 2 children. And those 2 children had just signed a deed and spent 2 weeks with a shovel to take the buildings that stood on 40 acres of ground that was already, by law, theirs. Della understood then what Dale Merchant wanted. She took the cream-colored card out of her coat pocket, the one she had carried for a month without thinking about it, and she read the line under his name again, the line that had meant nothing to her the day he handed it to her. Renewable energy acquisitions. 40 acres of flat open ground 3 miles from a substation, with a county road to it and nothing on it but a dead fairground the county was desperate to be rid of. She thought about the way he had sought them out twice in the cold, the $1,000, the walk-away money, the smooth, kind voice telling 2 girls to take the cash and go somewhere warm and never think about Corliss again. He had not been trying to buy a worthless fairground. He had been trying to buy 40 acres of land off 2 orphans who did not know they owned it before anyone told them they did. It got worse before it got better, the way these things do. When the girls filed the deed and the lease with the county recorder to make their ownership of record, Dale Merchant found out within the week. Because Dale Merchant found out about everything that touched land in Ray County, and he did not give up gracefully. He hired a lawyer from Lincoln, and the lawyer sent the girls a letter full of long sentences, arguing that the lease had contained a renewal that carried the land to the Fair Association, that Silas Marsh's estate had never been properly probated, that 2 young women with no address and no standing could not simply appear and claim 40 acres, that the matter would need to go before a judge. It was meant to frighten them, and it did frighten Junie, who had spent her life on the wrong side of official letters and knew how they usually ended. But it did not frighten Della, because Della had the ledgers and the deed and the lease in Silas Marsh's own hand and the letters and $214,000 that changed, all by itself, what kind of fight this was going to be. They hired a lawyer of their own, a woman in the county seat named Pruitt who had grown up going to the Ray County Fair as a girl, and who took one look at the 1954 lease and the recorded deed and the whole shining paper trail Silas Marsh had left folded in the back of a ledger and told them, plainly, that they would win. And they did win, though it took until spring. There was a hearing, and Silas Marsh's estate was opened at last and passed clean through Nadine to her daughters, and the land was confirmed as theirs. And Dale Merchant's lawyer's long sentences came to nothing, because a 50-year lease that expires is a 50-year lease that expires, and a deed in the county records is a deed in the county records, and no amount of money from Lincoln could argue with a dead mechanic's careful paperwork. Merchant himself never came to the fairgrounds again. The girls did not go after him. There was talk in town, once it all came out, about what he had tried to do, and some people would not do business with him after. And that was punishment enough, and none of their doing. Della was asked once, by a man from the county paper, whether she was angry at Dale Merchant, and she thought about it and said no. She said he had only wanted the land. Her grandfather had wanted the town. She said you could tell everything about a man by which one he wanted, and that she did not need to say anything worse about Dale Merchant than that. They fixed the wheel. That was the spring's work, and it took most of the summer besides. Junie got the south footing jacked up to level and poured properly this time, and they hired a crew out of Grand Island that knew old amusement rides to go over the whole structure, the bearing and the spokes and the seats and the brake, and the crew boss, An old man himself, climbed up to the maintenance platform and found the little plate with S. Marsh punched into it and came down and asked the girls who that was. And when they told him, he took his hat off, up there on the ladder, which the girls did not see but the crew did, and it went around coreless by the end of the week. They repainted the wheel, the color it had been in the old photographs, a white that went gold at the top when the sun caught it. And on a Saturday in August, on the weekend the Ray County Fair had always run, they turned it on. They had not planned a fair. They had only meant to run the wheel, to see it turn, to have it standing plumb and lit for the first time in 11 years. But word had gotten around all spring, the whole story of it, the pipe and the bonds and the ledgers and the granddaughters and everything Silas Marsh had done in the dark for 50 years, and the town would not let it be a small thing. Ruth Kessler organized it, mostly, from a booth at the Blue Star. People brought their 4-H animals and their canning and their quilts. The Lutheran church ran a food stand. Somebody found the old prize ribbons in a box in the exhibition hall, and they gave them out again, and every ribbon that year had a small card pinned behind it that Della had printed, that said the premium had been paid, as it had been paid so many times before, in the name of Silas Marsh. Della had used a little of the money for that, and for the paint, and for the crew, and she meant to use more of it the same way, year after year. She had gone to the lawyer Pruitt and set up a fund, a real one now, endowed and permanent, so that the prize money at the Ray County Fair would never run short again, not in her lifetime or long after it, and so that no child who won a ribbon in Corliss would ever learn that the money behind it had come up short, because a man had made sure of it once, quietly, and now his granddaughters had made sure of it forever. They named the fund for him. They put his name on it in plain letters. It was the one thing they did loudly, and they did it on purpose, because he had done everything else in silence, and somebody owed him the noise. The wheel turned at dusk. The whole town was there, 1,100 people in a field where nothing had happened for 11 years, and the seats filled. And Junie ran the controls because Junie understood the machine, and Della rode the first car up with Ruth Kessler beside her, up into the gold light at the top where you could see the whole town laid out below and the lights coming on and the grain elevator catching the last of the sun. Ruth held Della's hand the whole way up and did not say anything, and Della looked down at the fairgrounds her grandfather had kept alive with his own hands and his own money for 51 years, at the booths and the barn and the crowd and her sister small below at the controls, and she thought about the letter, the line pressed hard into the paper. I did one thing right in my life. I kept the wheel turning. He had kept it turning so that 2 girls he never met could come home cold and broke on the last of their money and find, in the ground beneath it, not just a fortune, but a father's apology and a town's whole hidden history and a name worth carrying. The bonds had come to $214,000. But that was never the fortune, and both girls knew it, riding up into the light. The fortune was the wheel, still turning, and the town gathered under it, and the fact that a quiet man's whole life had turned out to have been, all along, a message in a bottle addressed to the only 2 people in the world who would ever open it. What a man builds when no one is watching is the truest thing he ever builds. And Silas Marsh had built a whole town's worth of it in the dark, and trusted a wheel to hold it, until the 2 who belonged to him came home and dug it up into the light.